One of the biggest questions in the theory of public choice is how much freedom do we give up to the government for our safety? This is a complex issue and has been discussed for centuries. On one hand, you want to give up your freedom to the government to ensure your safety from potential threats. They will provide you with a greater sense of security and protection. On the other hand, you may feel like your rights are being violated by giving up your freedoms to the government, and that the government is overstepping its bounds. Ultimately, the balance between freedom and safety is largely due to cultural, political, and societal norms. In some countries, there are strict laws to ensure safety. There are surveillance cameras in public areas. They have mandatory identification checks. While these measures do provide some security, it does bring up questions about privacy and government overreach. In other countries, there's less emphasis put on safety, which allows more freedom for its citizens. While this does provide them with a sense of liberty, it also does increase the risk of potential danger. So how do we find out the optimal level of freedom and safety within a society? I created a model based off of the budget maximizing bureaucracy model to determine what the optimal amount of freedom to safety is within a society. First, we'll go over some assumptions about this model. The first assumption is that the government wants more control over its people. The more control the government has over its people, the more likely they are to stay in power. Also, the more likely they are to increase their budgets and increase their salaries. This is a pretty safe assumption because if governments wanted less control over their people, the government would then just dismantle itself, which doesn't happen. Number two is that without the government, we still have some safety, that the government isn't required for us to have safety. This is just our basic personal safety. We are accountable for ourselves and our own actions and defending ourselves. We will always have that regardless of what kind of government is in place in our society. And the last assumption is that it is possible to have no freedom and yet it is impossible to have no safety. It's possible to have no freedom because the government could take all of our freedoms away, while we always have a little bit of safety based off of assumption 2. The model shows control on the x-axis, which is the amount of control that the government has over its people. Control is gained by rules, laws, and regulations passed by the government on its people. On the y-axis is utility, or the amount of value you gain from either freedom or safety. When there is no government, control is 0, and you have unlimited freedoms, and you have very little safety. When you have a large controlling government, you have the maximum amount of safety, but you have the least amount of freedom. As we increase control in the government, we increase our safety, but we pay for that safety through our freedom. So as we increase control, we increase our safety and we decrease our freedoms. We give more control to the government by passing laws that are beneficial for society. Laws that will decrease our freedoms, but will increase our safety. For example, by making murder illegal, we increase our safety by making murder illegal, so less people will murder. But we also decrease our freedom by not allowing us to murder. Although it seems weird that not being allowed to murder someone is considered a freedom, it is still an act that we can commit that is not allowed by the government, which would then mean that is a freedom that is no longer allowed, or a freedom that is taken away from us. We pass laws like that because it is beneficial. The amount of freedom that we gave up to not murder someone is a very small amount of freedom, while the value we gain from making murder illegal vastly outweighs the cost of the freedom that we paid for it. This is why increasing the control of the government can be a good thing, because we give up very little freedom for a lot of safety. Although, this does not mean that we give the government all the control they want. Increasing government control is beneficial up until point Z on the model. This point is where the value of safety and the value of freedom are equal. Up until point Z, you have increasing returns to scale, which means the more control that you're giving to the government, you are paying a very small price of freedom for a very large value of safety. So it's beneficial. You want to keep increasing control of the government as long as you're getting increasing returns to scale. After point Z is when you get decreasing returns to scale. So now you're paying more in freedom for a lesser value of safety. Although after point Z, you do have decreasing returns to scale, the aggregate amount of safety that you gained from the amount of freedoms you gave up is still positive. So it's still a good thing. That is until you reach the perpendicular blue line. This line indicates where the volume of A and B are equal, which means that the amount of freedom that you gave up is equal to the amount of value of safety that you gained. So anything past this point, you are giving up more freedoms for less safety overall, which is very bad. Past that blue perpendicular line is when increasing control of the government is a net negative. That blue line is the amount of control that we never want the government to ever cross. But that doesn't mean that's the goal where we're trying to reach. The optimal amount of government control is where point Z is. That is where we get our most bang for our buck for the amount of freedoms we give up for our safety. The location of this point is really determined by the citizens of the society. There could be an argument that we're never actually at point Z, but we're always striving towards it as our culture shifts and our politics change. Or another argument is that we are always at point Z, so as our politics and culture changes, point Z changes with us, so we're always at equilibrium. I personally believe that we are never actually at point Z, but we're always striving towards that equilibrium. Another interesting benefit about this model is that you can tell where people believe point Z is based off of their political views. If someone believes that we need to spend more money on social programs, then you could assume that they believe that we're on the left side of point Z, that more government control will lead to an optimal society. While if someone believes that there are too many government regulations and we need a freer market, you could assume that they think that we're on the right side of point Z and that less government control will lead to a more prosperous society. One important thing to note is why that blue line in the model is so important to us. The government has the ability to convince its citizens that we need more safety at the cost of more freedom up until this point. They can easily convince us up until then because the overall net benefit of the government control is still positive. Don't mix this up with point Z though, that is the point of optimal freedom for safety. But exactly at that blue line is where the overall net benefit is 0, and past that, the net benefit is negative. This is exactly what the government did to us during COVID. They enforced lockdowns and different rules and regulations limiting our freedoms. And it was all for the purpose of safety. But the amount of freedoms that we gave up was not worth the amount of safety that we gained from this government control. But the government was able to convince people because the overall net benefit was still positive. We did not reach that blue line yet. So it doesn't look like the government is overreaching its bounds because the overall net benefit is still positive. Yet, if we look at specifically the government rules and regulations for COVID, we can tell that that's decreasing returns to scale, which is not the optimal outcome for society. This is what makes government so dangerous. It is the only entity that has the ability to coerce people and convince them to give up their freedoms for more safety. In reality, the government and its citizens are really just playing a game. One is trying to get more control while the other is trying to prevent it. So when you see its citizens trying to enforce the government to get more control, you should really be hesitant to see what side they're actually on. Because our job as citizens is to prevent government control, not promote it. Finding the right balance between freedom and safety is an ongoing struggle for governments and societies all over the world. It requires careful consideration of individual rights and social values, and the potential risks and benefits of different policies. What do you think about this issue, and how do you think we could find the optimal amount of freedom and safety within our society?